Hello, everybody. I figured I would come back by talking about something I like talking about gameplay design. For me, I consider gameplay design a skill, and most people are unskilled. Like with any skill, you have to learn it, and most people don't learn it. Nothing wrong with that, but what is wrong with that is that most of the essays you're going to find online are over here somewhere, and they're theoretical essays. It's fun to read them. You can read all about, theory of fun or theory of skill or MDA or any of those other kinds of, theory books and theory articles, but in the end, you're not going to learn very much practical knowledge from them because they're not full of practical knowledge. They kind of expect you to get your practical knowledge from experience. Well, I figured that what I would do is I would litter the path here with some basic stuff. And in particular, I want to talk about mechanisms and mechanics that you can use and how they affect your gameplay and how they affect your players. A lot of people are really into cloning their favorite game, but with some small tweak. Like, for example, I really love Minecraft. I'm going to create Minecraft, but you sail around on ships. Something like that, right? And that's great. It's a heartfelt appreciation for the original game, and you're trying very hard. You're not going into the Apple Marketplace and just cloning whatever's on top to try and make a cheap buck. You're trying to create something that you've been inspired by. That's great. But the problem is that most people don't know how their personal tweaks are going to change the way the game works. Minecraft itself is not a very well-designed game. It's mostly luck and timing that brought it into its position as a very huge game. But it has some very strong underlying pieces to it, and you can make those underlying pieces work better or worse depending on what else you add in and how you tweak them. Adding in something like being able to sail around on a ship as your primary base would radically change the way that Minecraft plays. It doesn't sound like a huge change if you don't really think about it, but as you think about it, you're going to realize that all of the construction that's going to happen, 99% of it is going to be on a ship rather than sprawled out on a world. Your collection, you're not going to be doing a whole lot of deep core mining with a huge mine system because you're going to be moving on to a different location. There's a whole bunch of changes, and those need to be taken into account. You can actually make a better game, in theory, because you can make a game which works well with the mechanics you've chosen. But you have to know what mechanics are available. You have to know how they interact. You have to know all that stuff. And I figured I would start with the most basic mechanic, and that is random numbers. Now, random numbers are part of basically every game ever made, and in this case I'm talking about random numbers that the player gets to see. Things like to hit rolls and damage rolls and stuff like that. So the most common kind of random number is a flat number, and this would be, or a flat range, and this would be, for example, when you have a percentage and you say, okay, well, you've got an 87% chance to hit, and we're just going to get a random number between 0 and 99 or 1 and 100, and we are going to see whether or not it's greater than or lower than that. The problem with flat numbers like this is that they feel unfair because the player will remember the exceptional numbers and blame the game. So, for example, there are several games I've played where I would miss several times in a row with values of 87%, which is why I picked that number. This is something that happened a lot even recently when I was playing the new XCOM game. Not the newest one, but the original new one. And I would say, oh, I've got a great chance to hit, and I'd miss, and I'd miss, and I'd miss, and I'd just miss all the time. Going back and looking at it, I didn't actually miss all the time, but what I did is I remembered those misses, and I forgot all the hits. Just the way it works, right? So if you are going to do a flat number, you've got to be careful because your players are going to remember the exceptions, and they're gonna feel like it's unfair. Now another option is a weighted range or a weighted number, and that would be something like 3d6. This is generally a situation where you take several random numbers and you either add them together or you treat them separately or you discard the extremes, stuff like that. And the result is that you tend to get a range of numbers that's centered around a particular value. So if you were to roll 3 dice, for example, anyone who's played D&D knows that you're going to get something like this, where here we have 10 and 11, 12, and here we have 18, and here we have 3. Now you can also make these percentages. I mean, there is a specific percentage chance of rolling an 18, and that's not, you can certainly represent it like that, but the player doesn't represent it like that. If you say, well, if you roll 3d6 and you've got to roll a 4 on at least 2 of them, the player doesn't think of that in terms of having a specific percentage chance of happening. The player thinks of that in terms of it feeling good or feeling bad. Moreover, if you say 87% chance in this situation, that would be something like rolling 17 or 18. That would be a failure if you roll a 17 or an 18, or a failure if you roll a 3 or a 4. If I were to roll these dice and I were to come up with snake eyes, I would remember that I came up with snake eyes. I wouldn't remember that I failed a roll that had an 87% chance to succeed. I would remember that I personally botched the roll by rolling snake eyes. So these weighted values, your players aren't going to blame the game for the extremes. They're going to blame their own luck, because they're the ones that are rolling multiple things and getting coincidental, stacks of values. Weighted values are a little bit difficult to do in a computer game just because you have to represent them in a way that the player can immediately grasp. And for a lot of players, if you're going to be like, okay, well, I'm going to roll 8 virtual dice, the player's going to be like, why? Just give me the number. So while this is a great option for tabletop games, it can be difficult to display in a way that the player will feel is good or correct. One way around that is that you can have each of these quote-unquote dice be an in-game object or step or character. For example, if you are going to do something in a Mario game and you've got, it's Paper Mario, for example, you've got an RPG, and your character has 3 attacks in his pattern, whack, whack, whack. Well, you can pop up a number for each of those attacks, and then the rules can be that those get added together, or that you have to get above a 4 on 2 of those, or whatever. But because they are individual pieces of what's going on in the game world, the player won't feel like you're rolling extraneous dice. Now, the third option is to make them player-controlled. Player-controlled dice, or numbers, are a really interesting situation because they can add a tremendous amount of power to your game. Now, there are a couple of ways to do this. One way to do this would be, for example, if you roll 3d6 and you let the player discard whichever one they want, that's going to always go in the player's favor, and it's no different than weighting the dice by dropping the lowest one automatically. But on the other hand, if you roll 3d6 and then you give the player an option to re-roll one of the dice by spending, a point of some kind of karma or whatever, then what you've done is you've given the player more control over the random number by asking them to sacrifice something in exchange for better numbers. That's a very powerful tool. So one of the options you have is the replacement, where you roll a whole bunch of dice and then you allow the player to re-roll if they want to by spending some kind of resource. A very similar method that I'd like to make sure you understand is the idea of having a limited number of numbers. So this is very common in card games. So if a player has a hand of cards, and you can ask the player to drop whichever card they would like on this particular roll, that gives the player the opportunity to spend more or less of their resources depending on how much they think of the challenge. Now obviously this is only valuable if the player doesn't know exactly what the target number is. Maybe it's 2 people playing cards against each other, for example, or maybe it's just a hidden value that they don't know. But either way, this allows the player to have a lot of control over how the game goes, over how the player progresses. And it gives you a kind of resource. By allowing the player to control these numbers, you're giving the player a new resource, just as important as hit points or mana or gold. You're giving them luck as a resource. And it's the same thing even if you abstract it out as being able to re-roll a die because you rolled a 1 and you can spend a piece of karma on it. It's all the same basic idea. You're giving the player control, and you're giving them a new resource. And that resource can be manipulated just like any other resource in the game. And you can have, say, enemies that actually manipulate it, or you can make it so the player will want to stop certain places to refresh their luck pool. All of these things are perfectly acceptable. But I wanted you to understand that you're not stuck with the flat percentages. Nearly everyone who does random numbers uses flat percentages because it's very easy to program, and it's crystal clear to you, the developer, that it's always a flat percentage. But you can also take a weighted percentage, which is a great opportunity to make the player feel like they are the ones responsible. And you can also take a player-controlled number, in which case the players literally are the one responsible. Now, this is just a psychological trick, basically, but don't underestimate those, because a game is a psychological trick. And this, of course, is an actual way to integrate numbers into your game, into your flow. You have a stat now, you have a resource. I think that that's probably worthwhile to discuss, and I figured I'd make it nice and short to start with, and yeah. Let me know if you like this kind of talk, and whether or not I should make more videos like this. And that's it for today.